Yeah. Dear Abdulrazak Gurnah, dear students and colleagues, dear guests, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 32nd Hermann Staudinger Lecture of FRIAS, the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies, which I have the honor to direct. My name is Ralf von den Hoff, and on behalf of FRIAS, the International Research College of our university, I warmly welcome you and our guest speaker, Abdulrazak Gurnah, today. We are truly grateful, and it's a great honor, Professor Gurnah, that you accepted our invitation to come to Freiburg. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. The Hermann Staudinger Lectures are a special event series organized by FRIAS. Since 2008, we have annually invited Nobel Prize laureates to present their work here in Freiburg. However, this 32nd Staudinger Lecture is a premiere. The series is named after Hermann Staudinger, an organic chemist at Freiburg University who received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1953. He is one of 10 Freiburg professors who are Nobel laureates since 1927. For FRIAS, the namesake, Staudinger, from the natural sciences, has traditionally shaped the series, with speakers only from the natural sciences and economics. Today, we are excited to change that tradition, and it's a special honor and achievement to welcome Professor Gurnah as the first Nobel laureate in literature as a Hermann Staudinger lecturer at Freiburg. I would also like to add my warmest thanks to the German Friends of Freiburg University in the United States, and namely to Jeffrey Himmel, for their generous support which made this invitation possible. Before the Vice Rector of our university, Michael Schwarze, will say some words of welcome, allow me briefly to introduce Professor Gurnah, though many of you will already be familiar with his work. Born in the ex-Sultanate of Zanzibar in East Africa, now part of Tanzania, which was a former German colony, Abdulrazak Gurnah came to the United Kingdom as a refugee in 1968. He earned his PhD in literature from the University of Kent in 1982, where he taught postcolonial literature until his retirement in 2017. I won't go into details of his literary career, but since his debut novel, Memory of Departure, published in 1987, his work has focused on themes such as exile, colonialism, and the complex encounters and biases arising from different cultural and identity backgrounds between Africa, Asia, and Europe. Some of his notable novels include Paradise, German Das verlorene Paradies, 1994, Gravelheart, German Das versteinerte Herz, 2017, and Afterlives, German Nachleben, 2020. His latest novel, titled Theft, has been published just a couple of weeks ago, up to now only in English. Since 2006, Gurnah has been a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. In 2021, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature with the Nobel Committee citing his, quote, uncompromising and compassionate exploration of the effects of colonialism and the fate of refugees caught between cultures and continents, unquote. And in 2023, he delivered the annual Schiller Lecture at the Deutsches Literaturarchiv Marbach, also addressing the need to further coming to terms with colonialism in Germany. What I find most moving in Gurnah's novels is the way he portrays deeply human characters, most of them victims in different senses of the word, broken, displaced, traumatized, far beyond colonialism, yet presented with elements of irony and humor. This creates a profound sense of empathy and compassion, allowing readers to shift perspectives, to connect with a diverse array of characters, and to experience a multi-layered complexity of intercultural encounters, a sort, I would say, of anti-single point of view. This offers a unique perspective on, and what literature is all about, an imagination of living together as a challenge, far beyond romantic ideals, and purely pessimistic, though necessary, critiques of ongoing colonialism. And this cannot and should not be without consequences for political, societal, and cultural decisions to be taken nowadays. Now we all are excited to hear what you, Abdulrazak, would like to share with us and argue for under the title Living Together. Once again, a very warm welcome to you, and thank you so much for being with us today. I give the word to our Vice Rector, Michael Schwarze. Thank you very much for being here.
Dear Abdulrazak Gurnah, esteemed colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure and honor that I welcome you all to the 32nd Hermann Staudinger Lecture, and on the behalf of the Rectorate, and indeed on behalf of the whole university community, I extend a warm welcome and express gratitude to Abdulrazak Gurnah for accepting our invitation to join us today. As we know, this afternoon promises a deep reflection on what it means to live together, a question that also one of Gurnah's characters, the hospitable businessman Khalifa, addresses quite poignantly, and I'm now quoting from Afterlives. Quote, "You don't have anywhere to live, and it is likely you will continue to live with us. I would like you to continue to live here with us, so that too is another reason we need to know more about you." Hamza, a Shaim, traumatized war veteran who was part of the Askari Schutztruppe, does not volunteer much information. He seems worried that, that his life narrative is somewhat tainted and does not meet his quasi-family expectations. Quote, "You want me to tell you about myself as if I have a complete story, but all I have are fragments which are snagged by troubling gaps, things I would have asked about if I could, moments that ended too soon or were inconclusive." A short aside. The book does deliver a lot more information to the reader, and this is page 206 after all. So, I know this is a sort of cliffhanger, but I recommend to you to get the book if you're also intrigued about Hamza now. But back to Hamza and Khalifa. Khalifa replies, "You're already telling me a lot. And this is the or a moment in which a meaningful dialogue and mutual understanding unfolds. It even leads to an approval of Hamza's marriage plans, but to know more, as I said, do read the book. Living together, not despite our differences, but perhaps stronger through our fragments, gaps, traumas, inconsistencies, strangeness, that constitute our unique qualities, and living thought of in different stages, securing survival which has never been and still is not assured for everyone, and once it is assured, being able to thrive together. And what does it mean for us as an academic community? How can we live together and thrive with a vibrant community of over 24,000 students and nearly 7,000 staff members? I envision a united collective that embraces and celebrates diversity and assumes responsibility. We have this obligation towards our members, but our responsibility, I believe, extends beyond our academic walls. We have the duty to stand in for fundamental democratic values, especially in times of rising nationalism and misinformation. In this sense, Abdulrazak Gurnah's work on colonial history, which is also German history, and its enduring legacies play a pivotal role in challenging its readers' assumptions and biases. During your tenure as professor at the University of Kent, you've influenced and inspired many generations of students and researchers, and I probably do not need to mention that your work resonates powerfully with several initiatives currently here underway at the University of Freiburg. Abdulrazak Gurnah, we could not have hoped for a more fitting individual to inaugurate the new chapter of our lecture series. Thank you once again for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introductions and for the invitation. In fact, the invitation, as you correctly kind of summarized at the beginning, was to say this is a series of lectures which usually are given by an academic who's a natural scientist. And we would like to make a departure from this and have somebody come and talk about literature. Well, it was tempting, that sort of invitation. So eventually, when it was possible, I said, yes, okay, I'll come and do it. My title is Living Together, and it's really quite inspiring to hear, the way it was introduced, even if, in a sense, it kind of spares me from having to do the, the democratic values bit that you did there. But I'm very grateful, very glad that you did do so, because it is something that we should always be thinking about and being aware of. So, some years ago, I was invited to participate in a seminar which brought together literary scholars from a number of British universities. Some of them were already eminent, and others were expected to become so in due course. The topic for our discussion was the same as mine here, living together. The question that arose to me at once was who or what does together refer to? Does it refer to difference in religion, language, and social practice? Does it refer to living together with foreigners? Does it begin with the assumption that we are the normative and are invited or are being urged to deal kindly with strangers? On the other hand, together implies mutuality, how we might live together rather than how foreigners might learn to live with us. How we understand this phrase, living together, may have a very important inflection on how we construct difference. The gathering I referred to was one of literary scholars, not sociologists or moral philosophers, although there is no reason why literary scholars can also be those other things. Nonetheless, there had to be a literary dimension intended, and that was most likely an invitation to reflect on the relationship of scholarship to the literature it studies. In other words, an invitation to address the question, what is the work of literary criticism? What good does it do? We think of literary criticism as engaged in studying and explicating texts, their traditions, their context, both as culture and narrative. And the good in it, what good does it do? The question I just asked. And the good in it would be whatever good we look for when we engage in the study of literature. The other good in it, I suppose, would be a social good, making more possible the project of living together, of understanding ourselves better. And it is not difficult to imagine that these two goods overlap in some respects. I'll return to this idea of the good of literature and of understanding ourselves better. But for now, let me remind you of the lines from the opening scene of Shakespeare's Othello. When Roderigo comes to warn Desdemona's father of Othello's courtship of Desdemona. This moment, scene 1, this moment is preceded by a bawdy exchange between Rodrigo and Iago, during which they express their disdain for Othello. They call him the thick lips, the old black ram, the barbarian, and they express their disgust at the possibility of his union with Desdemona. Here is part of what Rodrigo says to Desdemona's father. So I'm quoting these lines from the play. Rodrigo speaking to Brabantio, Desdemona's father. Your daughter, if you have not given her leave, has made a gross revolt, tying her duty, beauty, wit, and fortunes in an extravagant and wheeling stranger of here and everywhere. Consider that extravagant and wheeling stranger of here and everywhere, not of somewhere in particular, not of anywhere in particular. Rodrigo is not at this moment concerned about specifying the origin of the Moor, but rather of rendering his foreignness as imprecise and the idea of his origin as diffuse and vagrant. The subject of the play is the love of the Moor for a Venetian woman, and hence all about living together. Rodrigo's warning is motivated both by self-interest, he had asked and been refused Desdemona's hand, and a refusal of accepting that possibility of living together. Venice of the 1600s was still the center of the European Mediterranean, what Wordsworth described as the safeguard of the West in a poem on the extinction of the Venetian Republic. So it was the safeguard of the West against the expansion of Ottoman power. But to the Elizabethan world, it was exotic and somewhat licentious in its ways. This period coincided with what was also the beginning of large-scale English mercantile naval adventures across oceans, the beginning of empire, and the increasing contact with different cultures and peoples meant that they needed to be described and made comprehensible. But the desire to describe was not only concerned to render the exotic explicable. What was different in this period was the scale of new arrivals in England compared to historical precedents. The numbers were not huge by contemporary standards, a few thousands over a period of 2 decades, but in appearance they seemed alarming, both statistically as well as in the visible concentration of the strangers in particular areas of the city of London, and the provinces. The motives of the strangers were also mixed. Whereas before they had been largely commercial, this new influx was influenced by the political position of England as Protestant haven. The strangers in this case were Huguenot French and Protestant Dutch, and many of them had come to stay. It was a phenomenon that caused great consternation, including a special inquiry commissioned by the government into, this was the title of the inquiry, Strangers Settled Among Us. The reception of these strangers demonstrates, perhaps initiates, the twin traditions in Britain of asylum and xenophobia. that are still competing today in the debates about asylum seekers. The point is not to say that English xenophobia was unique in Europe. Every other European country has its own xenophobia. But with the increasing identification of 17th century England as a Protestant sanctuary, this hostility is twinned with asylum, which is enacted as a centralized state policy with its complex and actively interventionist bureaucracy. My interest here is not in exploring the historical consequences of this policy, which, despite the tensions it generated in English society, probably was highly influential in preparing the English economy for expansion. Rather, I'm interested in indicating a historical moment when one of the strands of the modern construction of a narrative of strangers begins, and of which Othello itself might be taken as an example. The political object of these traditions of xenophobia and asylum has been transformed by empire and its consequences, perhaps especially with the extended period of the empire's dissolution. The hierarchical strategies that constructed the subjected as inferior in all respects also had consequences on how the stranger, especially the cultural stranger, might appear as a candidate for asylum. How different is the stranger? And how comfortably can he or she be accommodated? In the dissolution stages of empire and in the decline of the narrative of cultural hegemony, the stranger was more likely to be received with xenophobia. It might seem, therefore, that to attempt to see a connection between the 17th century European phenomenon, which was inflected in complex ways by religion and politics, and the migrations that were contemporary with the dissolution of empire and the beginning of a new phase of capitalism, is to stretch a point. Both phenomena are complex and multidimensional in both contexts and periods. My interest in the 17th century moment is in the initiation of a modern discourse of asylum, which coexists with a xenophobic narrative that constructs the stranger as eternally alien and to some extent tragic, and which have been profoundly influential in the narratival traditions of postcolonial migrations. In other words, the ambivalence is about living together that is apparent in English writing about the presence of the stranger, as with the Moor in Othello, or Caliban in The Tempest, or later on 19th century writing from Bronte, Dickens, Thackeray, and so on. One can find endless examples. So the ambivalence about living together that is apparent in English writing about the presence of the stranger draws its own response from the stranger thus constructed, who moves back and forth between hostility and affirmation, as we see in the writing of George Lamming or Aimé Césaire, for example. An analogous example of this response, but which is also quite different in many respects, is the unexpected result of traveling literature, or even the travel of the arts. I'm thinking of the way European music and literature have traveled as part of the baggage of colonial ascendancy. In particular, I'm thinking of South Africa, and the way European arts accompanied the settler enterprise in that country, as both solace and an expression of difference and superiority. The arts themselves were a testimony of the right to dominate. In time, especially in music and the theater, that relationship has been transformed by a liberating collaboration between the oppressor and the oppressed. And the result has been vibrant and exhilarating, where African voices have influenced European music into something new, and African bodies have transformed theater in remarkable ways. This, it seems to me, is an inspiring form of living together. I referred a while ago to whatever good we look for when we engage in the study of literature. And in relation to that, I will turn to another great writer. The early conception of Weltliteratur, a term or a paradigm which is credited to Goethe in 1827, arose in part out of the specific circumstances in the German states at the time. As John Peiser explains, one of the outcomes of the post-Napoleonic Congress of Vienna in 1815, a gathering of the victorious ancient regime, was the suppression of nationalist sentiments in the German states. Because small states were thought destabilizing and vulnerable to republican agitation, they were gathered into a German confederation under the aegis of Prussia and Austria. I'm sure you know all about this. The repression necessary to enforce this directive and its increasing futility enabled the cosmopolitan milieu in which a transnational concept such as world literature could emerge. This early idea of world literature had in mind as its main participants the French, the English, and the Germans, their texts, their critics, and their cultural histories. It is self-evidently a Eurocentric conception, both historically and in its aims, concerned to promote a cosmopolitan sensibility among modern European intellectuals. These intellectuals were ones who had selected themselves and because they had an understanding of poetics and aesthetics, and whose national literatures would be enriched by exposure to foreign, but each other's foreign. The note of high-handed parochialism, if not worse, in this formulation is countered by a reference to Goethe's remarks about reading a Chinese novel. Again, I'm sure many of you know this one. Because he found that the characters, I'm quoting, the characters think, feel, and act much like we do. Goethe, in other words, read a Chinese novel and discovered that the characters were as human as Germans. While this may seem to a certain way of thinking a generous gesture towards the global, it remains securely within a homogenizing European perspective, but it demonstrates an important consequence of what literature achieves. That is, increasing knowledge of the cultural other. In addition, Goethe was evidently interested in non-European literatures to an unusual degree, as is evident in his tribute to the poet Hafiz in his West Eastern Divan collection in 1819. So then, what is it that literature does for us? Let me say that to begin with, that the person who asks, what is the point of literature, is not going to be satisfied with whatever answer you give him or her. That person has not considered how vital story, song, and dance are and have always been to the very existence of a human community. Not as ornaments or distraction, but as the acts that enable empathy and solidarity and self-recognition in a coeval atmosphere. First of all, literature gives us pleasure, a profound pleasure which is not about making us smile or light of heart, but a pleasure which engages us and broadens our minds. If we don't feel this pleasure in reading a book or listening to an oration, we stop and put the book away. Or we switch off and stop listening. Secondly, literature tells us about what we know from a perspective we had not considered before. When I read Jean Rhys's White Sagasta Sea for the first time, it made me understand a great deal more than the novel Jane Eyre, the novel which Rhys was reading again. It made me understand the complicity that patriarchal structures demand, how a narrative about one woman's selfhood, Jane Eyre, disregards the humanity of the other in the name of colonial protocols. Jean Rhys takes the abused Creole woman out of the clutches of the racial ignominy that Charlotte Bronte had placed her and gives her her history back. Thirdly, literature brings us news. When I say news, I do not simply mean facts and information, but something that forces an engagement to the point of anguish and tells us about matters we did not really know. The text that always comes to mind for me in this respect is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Even if you had known something about the labor camps and the prison system in the Soviet Union, this text forces you into a deep and felt awareness of the brutal assault on the human spirit that incarceration in the Gulag meant. When you learn that the prisoners are marched out of the labor camp to the day's work site in temperatures of minus 48 degrees centigrade, imagination almost fails, because such knowledge is beyond your experience. Yet you learn that people endure even against such ordeals. Then literature also tells us about what we do know. It reassures us that our understanding of the world is shared, that how we feel is also felt by others. In other words, it reassures us about our humanity. That, I imagine, is what Goethe felt when he read that Chinese novel. I would like to suggest that in addition to studying and explicating and whatever other good we associate with literature and its scholarship, that we go to writing because it engages us beyond our capacity to describe what it has done. It is as much this unspeakable quality as the desire to engage with the philosophical and the eloquent that cleaves criticism to its subject. At best, then, to return to my starting point, the writer and the critic live together because the critic is also a reader and knows about how to keep silent about matters that cannot be spoken about. I worry about the pressure to speak when the critic is compelled or feels that it is necessary to provide information and direction on how to understand the context of the writing in terms of culture and community. The issue of who has the authority to speak is always present in literary scholarship. It seems to me that this particular pressure is stronger when the culture is other or strange to us. For the writer, the issue of knowledge has always been a concern, especially in what we now call postcolonial writing, and certainly the form of it that is writing in English from formerly colonized territories and cultures. How much to tell? How much to assume the reader knows? The pressure on the critic to provide information can be intense. In matters of great concern, the critic must not coerce, must not squander the writer's experience by insisting on reducing it to the speakable. I will end by invoking the advice of Gayatri Spivak to quote her, surrender to the text. Her advice comes in part out of exasperation with the anthologizing practices in the academy, where short translated excerpts are gathered together as if they constitute a representation of literatures of the world, when in reality, translation requires a much more nuanced process. This advice is also an echo of Goethe and refers to the task of the translator to resist preconceptions but also to be alert to the process of transmission from one historical and cultural moment to another. In Spivak's case, she is also concerned to be alert to the process where the text crosses the colonial context. It is perhaps good advice for the critic or the reader of any kind. Surrender to the text, if the desire is to learn to live together with a work of art. Thank you.